Ladies and gentlemen, let me just interrupt your dinner to introduce our speaker tonight, the EU ambassador, Hans-Dieter Schweisgut. This is a regular event at the club. It's not really a strict press conference. We try to blend the news aspect with a social event. When we sent out the notice, the Ukraine was not yet as high profile as it is now. But it's a pretty free-flowing event. So the ambassador is going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. He is going to talk about free trade agreements, I'm sure, although he's been very cagey about telling me what he's going to speak about. And then we'll go into the Q&A after, as I said, after about 25 minutes, and we'll wrap up around 8. So let me, without further ado, ask the ambassador to say a few words.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I don't need that, leave it there. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here with you tonight. I was here for the last time as a speaker. I think it was in November 2012, less than a year and a half ago. And you mentioned then that I was supposed to speak about the FTA tonight, and I will. And I remember already at the time, of course, most of the questions referred to the FTA, which at the time we hadn't really started to negotiate, but it was just when the European Union took a decision after quite a few years of preparation, as you know, to enter into those negotiations, which were started in March last year. But it just occurred to me also that when you had me here last time, apart from that, most of the questions were in fact about the state of the European Union and the Eurozone. It was still a time when there was quite a bit of speculation that the Eurozone would not be able to get out of its crisis. There was still talk about the collapse of the Eurozone, or at least a partial disintegration. And remember, it was also a time when we had a government headed by Prime Minister Noda at the time. And even though there was expectation that there would be a change in government after the elections to be held shortly thereafter, I think very few people would have thought that we could have a Prime Minister 3 months later who could say Japan is back and make it to the front page of The Economist. And I think a bit, I wouldn't really say the same thing has happened in Europe, but still, you know, when I had a discussion last week with a number of decision makers in the field of finance, when we started to talk about the Eurozone, the sort of reaction was, yeah, you seem to be doing fine. Let's talk about the Ukraine, let's talk about China, let's talk about other things. Now, I think, you know, from our perspective, we wouldn't really like to go just as far because there's always a bit the danger of complacency when you say we are out of the crisis. But in fact, it is rather comforting to see that we are now hoping to have growth this year in the magnitude of 1.5%, 2% next year. So the picture is completely different from what it was. And I would venture to say that this does not only apply to the economic field, but like always, you know, when you have a stronger economy, when you have more confidence, it also obviously also has an impact on your ambitions as a global actor. And I think a bit the same is probably true for Japan. And obviously, we also like to say that, look, the European Union is still looking to the future. We have grown to 28 last year. We started negotiations with Serbia, others are in line. So clearly, this is not a venture which is about to fade away. Also, let me just say that I have looked a bit back when we discussed should we do something to celebrate 40 years of the Commission opening an office here in Tokyo. And I'm not going to bother you, you know, with the history of those past 40 years. we'll find another occasion to do that. But I truly think that whereas not too long ago, and I think this was still to a certain extent the case in 2012, when we talked about increased cooperation, when we talked about the new agenda for EU-Japan relations, all this was nice, and I think we could easily agree that this is indeed what we want to achieve, but there was always a bit of a lack of substance, and I think there was also always a bit of a lack of genuine interest and a bit of a doubt whether the respective other party would really be able to deliver. And when I say deliver, I'm not talking only about trade issues in a narrow sense, but I'm talking more about an age where we see increasing competition between the United States and China, and where the question really arises, what is the space and the place for actors such as Japan and the European Union. Now, as I said, when you have a bit the confidence of economic growth in the short term, and I'm not going to venture on the future of Abenomics, and I'm not going to say much on where I think the European economy will be 5 or 10 years from now. But I do think for the time being, we know that we have to use sort of this backdrop for doing more internationally. And I think this is also what we are now for the first time with Japan. And I do think it's really for the first time we are serious about it, talk in more political terms. And obviously, I know that my colleague from the Ukraine was here. Was it yesterday? And this is something where we cannot nowadays, either as Japan and certainly not as Europe, just say, okay, we will not talk about the Ukraine today, it's not part of the agenda. It is part of the agenda, and it has become very much part of the bilateral agenda, just as a number of other issues. Neither Japan nor the European Union can afford sort of to just stand back and say, well, this is happening not in our immediate background, not in our immediate neighborhood. And this is why I do think that the prospects for cooperating with Japan also in areas which are not the immediate neighborhood, like the Middle East, Africa, have vastly improved. But let me come to the trade agenda for a moment at least, or a bit longer. Why is trade a driver now to the extent that we thought it wouldn't really be, or maybe not so much trade as trade policy? As you all know, at least bilaterally, this has a background of looking at our trade relation. And I think if we just very soberly assess where we have been going over the last 10 years, we would say, well, long before anybody had the idea of starting negotiations on a free trade agreement, let's say 10 years ago, Japan was still the third largest trading partner for the European Union, whereas the European Union was the second largest trade partner for Japan. It was also a time when we were still fretting about the trade deficit. Now, where are we now? We are at a situation where trade is roughly balanced, even with a bit of a surplus for the Europeans if you include trade in services. On the other hand, Japan has gone down in relative terms. It's now our 7th largest trading partner, whereas Japan slipped one rank behind China to number 3. Now you could say, well, obviously this has something to do with the fact that the growth areas are not in Europe and Japan, and it's partly true. It also has quite a bit to do with the fact that globalization means that bilateral trade balances are not so important anymore. And if you look, for instance, at the issue of the trade balance or the current account in Japan, well, we all know the reason why this is now completely different from the past. Japan's industry is to a large extent no longer concentrated only on production in Japan, and it's a bit the same in Europe. So I think that makes us also, I think, a bit more conscious to the fact that the international trade system is such and the rules of the game have changed. And obviously both Japan and the European Union had a large stake in getting WTO to work. But once it became clear, and it has become clear already quite a while ago, that the Doha round would not really go anywhere, not anywhere far, alternatives started to pop up. And therefore it was only natural that even those countries very committed to the international system would look for alternatives, not to replace WTO, but to complement it. And the European Union, I think, was a bit quicker on that than Japan. We started negotiations with quite a number of partners outside Europe, including in Asia. And of course, the prime motivation for Japan to ask for starting negotiation on a free trade agreement with the European Union was the fact that we had concluded one with the Republic of Korea. Now, you also know that there was quite a bit of reluctance on the European side to accept this offer in a way, for the simple reason that a lot of people were saying, well, we've had now quite a long history of trade relations with Japan. We had 20 or 25 years of the regulatory reform dialogue. Didn't really take us very far. So what would be different if we started negotiations? Would we ever be in a position to see real change, especially when it comes to non-tariff barriers, when it comes to government procurement, when it comes to specific sectors like railways, etc. You know the history, you know that we said, well, we want first to have a scoping of our mutual ambitions. We want to see that really written down in a report. We want also to see commitments. We want to see roadmaps of what you think you would be able to do to achieve a more balanced situation, especially in the non-trade barriers area. And when we finally sort of agreed to start negotiations, I think we did so in the confidence that there was a bit of a build-up here in Japan which had changed the equation to a certain extent. And in this respect, I'm not saying that things have necessarily changed much when Mr. Abe became Prime Minister. I think the change was there already before. And I think the reassurances we got in the framework of the scoping exercise were really already done by the government of Mr. Noda. And I think what was reassuring also was that we saw quite a bit of consistency. So over different governments, we didn't really see much of a change. And I think the commitments remained. What we said when we started negotiations in March last year is that, you know, that we still have, of course, this issue of the review after 1 year. You all know that the mandate the Commission has been given when it started negotiations was to conduct a review after 1 year, which would be submitted to member states to see whether Japan had implemented its commitments in the scoping report, the famous roadmaps on a number of NTBs. And we also said that once we start negotiations, we said we certainly don't want to delay the process. You don't start negotiations because you want to see them fail. You start them because you want to see them succeed, and hopefully you want to see them succeed quickly rather than in a delayed, drawn-out process. So we suggested to have 5 rounds of negotiations in the first year. We had 4 until the end of January. We have our 5th round in Tokyo starting on the last day of this month. And I think we already sort of have a reasonably clear picture of how negotiations are going. Now, when you negotiate, I think it's always easy to say, we have made very slow progress or little progress, or you can say things are proceeding better than we thought would have been the case. I'm trying not to fall in that trap and make any comparisons, but I think realistically, what we got out of the 4 rounds was a very clear and firm commitment on both sides to get this done. I'm not saying that the review is already a foregone conclusion, and I will not be able to say so even in private. I think we really have to wait for the next round and then for the assessment. But on the other hand, I think those who had suggested that Japan would be not in a position to show that it was going forward on those non-tariff barriers and other issues clearly don't seem to have it gotten right. That would be my impression now. I know that you, in your announcement of tonight, referred in great detail to a number of issues in the NTB area, and I'm not going to comment on them in detail, but what I would like to say is that on a number of issues, from car safety standards to food additives to beef exports to pharmaceuticals to medical equipment, all areas where we had in fact been discussing with the Japanese side for years, not to say for decades, we clearly see that things are moving forward. I mean, it would be unfair to say just because we are not yet there, nothing is happening. So, on the other hand, we had hoped to possibly go a bit further already at the last round to exchange, for instance, tariff offers in the area of market access, which I think we have not been able to do yet. I think there are still sort of some differences in perceptions of what we think is necessary already at an early stage. I mean, we had the Commissioner for Agriculture here last year, and we had the Commissioner for Trade here, and I think both made it abundantly clear that obviously we are aiming at an ambitious agreement, but we're also aiming at the balanced agreement. You only can have a good trade agreement if both sides have the feeling that while no party has gotten 100% what it set out to achieve, both are reasonably satisfied or only modestly dissatisfied. And therefore, we also said that one area where we see progress as absolutely essential is on processed food, beverages, and related areas, because that's where I think there is a huge potential. That's where Europe is competitive. That's where it benefits the consumer. So while we respect that at least at this stage in negotiations, the famous 5 sacred areas might be considered as sensitive for the time being, what we cannot accept is that because wheat is sensitive, pasta is also, because it is made of wheat. And I could go on, and you see what I'm hinting at. So I think we still have quite some way to go. But it is, I think, a situation where we would say nobody questions the wisdom of having entered into those negotiations subject to the review. And if that were to prove successful, I think we have a reasonable outlook for the future. Now, obviously, there are linkages, even if we are not talking about them. Both parties have other important trade negotiations they are engaged in, for Japan, TPP and others, for the European Union, TTIP and others. Let me just say also that obviously I could go on for quite a while talking about the trade investment agenda, and I think we will go on doing this in the Q&A session. But I think I also wanted to come back to what was my starting point, namely that we are in a situation where relations between Japan and the European Union can no longer be reduced to trade or even economic issues. And this is also why, little noticed by the public, we started negotiations not only on an FTA, but also on a parallel agreement, which is called the Strategic Partnership Agreement, and which focuses mostly on political, global and sectoral issues. And the reason for that is fairly simple. I mentioned already the Ukraine. I mentioned the Middle East. One of the issues on which a lot of time was spent over dinner at the last EU-Japan summit, obviously, was the situation in the Northeast Asian region. We are cooperating closely in the Gulf of Aden, which is a vital part of the shipping routes for both Japan and Europe, where we fight against piracy. I think in a way which few people would have imagined not too long ago. We are jointly engaged in giving support to the border control between Afghanistan and Tajikistan, things which will become more important once we have most of the forces leave Afghanistan. You all remember the hostage crisis and the killing of also Japanese citizens in Algeria last year. Again, one of the reasons why Japan is looking at Africa in a different way, not only from the development cooperation angle and as a market, but also from a security perspective. And this is what we want to also address in addition to the familiar global challenges from energy security, climate change, and also industrial policy, aging, things which we share, but we also want to address ways how to cooperate very specifically in the area of security and defense. And it was also I think for the first time that last week we had, at the invitation of the government of Japan, the chairman of the military committee of the European Union, General de Rousier, coming to Japan. And it was actually quite interesting to see him go through the military ceremonies under the flag of the European Union, which was, I think, a first in Japan. And in the discussion, and this is really a very broad point, but another high-level visitor was asked not too long ago by a Japanese member of the government, well, the European Union is obviously a very complicated thing to understand, and sometimes you are the European Union, sometimes you act as member states. Can you enlighten me a bit what really is the role, for instance, of the European Union when it comes to foreign policy and security issues? And the European interlocutor sort of gave a shorthand answer saying that, well, you know, had you asked me this question 10, 15 years ago, I would have answered, normally we do everything in this area as a state. And when we think it's fit to cooperate with others, then we'll do it jointly in the European Union. When you ask me now, the default mode is that we do it jointly. And we have to find good reasons why we would not do it jointly. And when the European Union is not doing it jointly, then usually it's pointed out as a failure to agree jointly or to act jointly. Clearly, the Ukraine will be a major challenge for Europe. It is a European country. It is something which will, in all likelihood, define to a certain extent also the perception of how we deal with those things internationally, but not only internationally. I think it's also likely to have an impact on how we see this from a member state versus union perspective. And in that respect, I think it's all linked also to where do we go from here. And I think that's a good point to end. Thank you.
I was hoping that we'd end on the answer to that question as opposed to on that question. But thanks very much, Ambassador. I do a couple of takeaways there, which I really enjoyed. One is the EU is back, and talk about how that kind of gets on the Abe bandwagon. And you're right, The Economist did have a cover on that. I think I can say, having once worked at The Economist, that the cover stories at The Economist would always take place at the turning point. So as soon as right after The Economist would say something has definitely happened, the opposite would happen, which is a problem in journalism more generally. But you also mentioned trade, which and you talk quite a lot about trade. Is obviously couched in fairly diplomatic language. I still get, and you're right about the food. I think that's interesting. I think you speak to a lot of European companies in Japan, and food is I didn't really realize this until I started talking to people about it, but certainly at the Food Expo, Italy had a gigantic pavilion, so there really is a lot of expectation for exporting food here. And some of these tariff barriers, as I outlined, and the points I made in the meeting notice were actually based directly on foreign business people in Japan who are complaining about these very, very complex rules and non-tariff barriers. I get a sense of guarded optimism about the progress on the trade, but I don't get the sense that you're really pulsating with optimism about the passage of it. Clearly, there's going to be many bitter struggles ahead. As you said, many of these issues. We get the EBC white paper every year, and essentially it gets rewritten from year to year, unfortunately. But then you touched on defense, and I think that's really interesting. And you mentioned something which I wasn't really aware of, this SPA. I think we're all focused on the FTA, the Free Trade Agreement. The aspect of the SPA is very interesting because I was speaking to a diplomat earlier today, and he mentioned that there's also some talk of a pipeline from Russia to Japan. And this is quite interesting because we know that one of the problems with the EU response to Russia has been the fact that a third of German natural gas comes from Russia, and that Russia is in this extremely powerful position in terms of being able to impose its will. Maybe that's too strong a word, but in terms of being able to negotiate in a very tough way with Europe because of its natural gas advantage, or because of its energy advantage. Maybe I could ask you that question. Is that SPA, could it be, we know that Japan's also had a long relationship, a troubled relationship along its border with Russia until the post-war settlement. Is this something where the EU and Japan could cooperate in terms of trying to hem in what's been happening in Russia, or is that perhaps too bellicose a view?
Well, is this working?
Yeah.
On your comment on trade, I'm not pulsating with optimism. I'm never pulsating with optimism. So guarded optimism, I think, is the right word. On your question with Russia, we have had discussions with Japan on Russia for years, and many times, obviously, whenever foreign ministers, diplomats meet, you compare notes. I think we are now in an interesting situation because clearly what's happening in the Ukraine, what happened in the Crimea on Sunday, is something which the international community has condemned as being against international law. There was a vote in the Security Council vetoed by Russia with an abstention from China. But if you look at all the other comments, I think you see sort of a common theme. If you look at what the Japanese government is saying and what we are saying, is basically we have a very strong interest to see a system maintained which is based on the rule of law and respect for international law. And this means that you cannot only look at the specific situation from a perspective of your more narrowly defined interest, be they commercial, energy security, or otherwise. It means that you have to balance a bit what you are saying and doing against your own credibility in a wider context. And this, I think, is what we are going to see. And I think this is what I refer to as a challenge. And I think it's a challenge not only for this country, it's probably the greater challenge for the European Union. We are closer. We are probably the ones who have more to offer to the Ukraine, because you all remember that the start of the demonstrations against the government on the Maidan Square were actually motivated by the fact that the then President Yanukovych refused to sign the association agreement with the European Union. So it's touching us more deeply, more directly. But the fact remains, that if we look at the Crimea, I think we are, as some people pointed out, no longer in a situation where we can accept that what might have been acceptable in the 19th or 20th century passes without a very strong reaction and very strong opposition from the international community. And this is why I think we all will see possibly painful decisions. There is still a way for Russia to come back, which we hope. That's the aim of sanctions, is never really to close the door. But at the same time, I think, and I guess this case was made fairly strongly by the Ukrainian ambassador, at the same time, I think we have to be credible.
Just to follow up on the point about defense, you've got Europe, where defense budgets in perhaps the most militarized country, the UK, have been severely cut back. Obviously, the UK suffered very badly from the financial crisis. France is much better. Germany is the constant butt of US criticism for underarming itself, again, for understandable historical reasons. Japan's defense budget is large, but there is some skepticism about the actual ability of its troops. Do you think there's a sense there where it's the blind leading the blind, where it's too sort of who is going to be afraid of that combination? Do you think that both countries need to? Are you advocating? Where's the view in the EU that at some point the EU does need to put itself together and put a lot more money into its defense budget, and that Japan needs to do so as well?
Let me comment on Europe in that respect. Yes, I think you're right. Actually, this has been an issue for a long time. On the other hand, and this is a bit, the crucial point when you talk about the European Union and Europe. On the one hand, you have defense spending, which is defined as a percentage of national GDP. And you referred rightly to individual countries, the UK, France, Germany, you can name others. On the other hand, we also know that with achieving further synergies in Europe, a lot could be done without necessarily increasing the combined defense budgets. And this is what the special meeting of heads of state and government last December basically was all about. It was the first time that you had heads of government coming together for a meeting solely for this purpose, to talk about defense policy and defense posture. So I think this is an interesting development. I'm just a bit hesitant, to tell the truth, to talk about increased defense spending in the context of a specific crisis, where you might sort of create the impression that by having a more credible military backstop or threat, you might achieve something which you would not be able to achieve by other means. And so I'm not saying that we should not really look carefully at defense spending and the necessity to increase it, to increase its efficiency. But I'm a bit hesitant to say yes, because the international situation seems to be becoming tense and tenser all the time. Therefore, we all need to increase our defense spending. I'd much prefer to talk about strategies, talk about solutions, which obviously will always have defense as a necessary element, but I think the time is behind us when solutions were achieved by war.
I think that's a very fair point. But
Can I ask whether
yeah,
anybody
sure.
else is going to be able to have a chance to
Yes, please. Apologies. Yes, yes.
Working press who would like, I'm sure,
You're
to
right.
ask questions.
Yeah. And does anybody have any questions? Gentleman at the right here.
My name is Hasegawa from Radio Nikkei. Well, as you have plenty of diplomatic experience in China, I would like to know your view on China. And recently, Europe, EU is approaching to China, especially after the visit of Cameron, UK Prime Minister. On the other hand, Japan and China relationship is not so good. So tell me what suggestion or what advice you have on to Japan on relationship with China.
Might be a dinner evolving into a breakfast, huh? Hasegawa-san, I think when it comes to China, let me limit myself to a few things from a European perspective. On the one hand, China is a very important economic partner. It's our second largest trading partner, not trailing far behind the United States. It is also a strategic partner with whom we increasingly cooperate on many issues. It is also for us an indispensable partner in solving many international issues and crises where in many cases it would be impossible to find a solution without the cooperation of China. At the same time, we are all aware that China is not a democratic country. We are all aware of the human rights situation in China. We have made it clear in also a public statement that we do not think that coercive behavior or the threat of or threats are conducive to solving problems. But at the same time, I think it's very clear that solutions to tensions in Northeast Asia will have to be found by the parties through peaceful and diplomatic means based on the rule of law. This is basically what the government of Japan is also saying. We cannot substitute for discussions and negotiations between Japan and China. But I think if you analyze the statements made by the government of Japan, in many areas we come to the same conclusion, namely that for both of us, China is a very important partner, and we would like to see China play an important constructive role in this area.
Sorry, I forgot your name. Yeah.
Ja, Daniel Leusink, het Financiële Dagblad, the Financial Daily from Holland. I've been based in Tokyo since 2007. And if I may take back the discussion to the FTA, because in an interview with Eurobiz magazine in 2012, you suggested that it was Japan that came up with the idea of negotiations on a free trade agreement, partly inspired by the fact that the EU had concluded an FTA with South Korea, but mainly inspired by former Prime Minister Yukio Hatoyama, the first Prime Minister of the DPJ. It's extremely rare to hear a leader like you in government, in business or politics, mention a positive economic initiative in relation to Mr. Hatoyama. Since then, the Japanese government has changed to a different political party. Has the change of government influenced the negotiation process of the FTA in any way? And if so, how? And if there would be another change of government before the end of the negotiation, and another Japanese party would come to power, how could that influence the negotiation process?
I think I had answered that question in my speech. The reason why I referred to Prime Minister Hatoyama in this Europe's interview was very simply because he was the one who suggested it at the summit meeting in 2009. So it was, it was not giving particular credit to a prime minister. It was just saying that he was the one who suggested it. And it was very simple to see why he suggested it, because it was immediately after we had concluded the free trade agreement with the Republic of Korea, which would eventually bring down tariff rates on cars and electronics, and therefore would put the Japanese car and electronics industry in a position of competitive disadvantage. Now, I also said that we conducted the scoping exercise under the previous government, actually under Prime Ministers Khan and Noda, and we started only last March with the Abe government, but at a time when all the preparations for starting had already been done. So we sort of were reassured that the change in government from the DPJ to the LDP did not bring with it any change in perception of the value of having an agreement eventually negotiated with the European Union. And there was also never any suggestion that the negotiating stance of Japan would change. So obviously we actually started under this government, but I think the question of how a possible change in government would affect that, I don't know, and I don't really want to speculate about this. I wish this government a long life, and us and Japan a hopefully limited duration of negotiations.
Thank you.
Good evening, Ambassador. I'm Silvia Zanlorenzi from Il Sole 24 Ore Italian. I was especially interested when you have mentioned other fields of cooperation between the EU and Japan, and you have mentioned rule of law, and somehow this was quoted in the answer the first you have given. So besides being a journalist, I am also an activist of Amnesty International in the Italian section, and my area is Eastern Asia, especially Japan. I can remember, Ambassador, being at the Istituto Italiano di Cultura, Italian Institute of Culture, last was 29th of October 2013 for this one-day seminar about death penalties. So I can say there are some rumors, but it's just rumors, of course, for us as Amnesty International, that Hakamada case could go by the end of this month on retrial. But it's just rumors that, the Japanese section say. So can we have a wider update of what are actually the other fields, such as human rights and rule of law, that the EU is carrying on, in China, but also in Japan? As an activist of Amnesty International, not really that unusual for me to have also actions on the comfort women issue, which is something that the EU as an institution has taken and presented in meetings. Thank you very much.
Yes, well, obviously, human rights is an integral part of our foreign policy, and therefore we do look at the human rights situations in all our partner countries. Now, with Japan, obviously, we also have a partner with whom we cooperate very closely on human rights issues internationally. You know that we jointly sponsor regularly resolutions in the Human Rights Council on the Democratic Republic of Korea, North Korea. You also know that we have issued many statements talking about joint values and the respect of human rights. Now, we also always say that there is one issue in the human rights area where we disagree, and that's the death penalty. And this is why we raise this regularly, and why we not only discuss it in our political meetings, but why we also think it's necessary for us to conduct outreach activities and also to cooperate with NGOs, including Amnesty International and others, the Japanese Lawyers Association, because we think that the argument which we usually hear, 80+% of the Japanese population are in favor of the death penalty, and therefore the government has no choice but to respect the wish of the people, is something which is, in our view, a flawed argument. I think in most, if not all, European countries, at the time when the death penalty was abolished, there would probably have been a majority of the people supporting the maintenance of the death penalty. And if you were to ask now, I think it's become something so accepted that you would hardly have a country where the reintroduction of the death penalty could be seriously discussed. So we do think there is scope for engaging the Japanese public in a better way, and hopefully we will have some success on that. You mentioned the issue of the so-called comfort women. On Well, you know, on the comfort woman, there have been opinions expressed, but at the same time, I think we also should sort of be a bit cautious in taking a stance when we are not completely clear what we are talking about. I think there have been expressions in the European Parliament when there was an indication that the so-called Kono statement might be called into question. As we all know, the Prime Minister has made a declaration in Parliament a couple of days ago where he came out very clearly on this, saying that this would not be called into question. And there was also a reaction from President Park, which was at least generally rather positive, hoping that this would be a basis to follow up on. Now, in the case of Europe, obviously there are some countries which seem which are more interested in that for the simple reason that they had their own cases, and therefore, you know, it enters into a discussion. But if I were to answer your question, is it raised at the official level between the European Union and Japan? The answer is no.
I said Siegfried, and then we'll go to you, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Siegfried Needle, freelancer from Germany. When the former Soviet Union was, and the East Bloc was dissolved, so the Soviet Union or then Russia hoped the Eastern European countries could act as a kind of a buffer state, okay, between Russia and Western countries. All Eastern European countries decided to stay with the West. Now, Ukraine is perhaps the last country now, really near to the Russian border. So, and this way the former security advisor, Kissinger, made a proposal for Ukraine to find a kind of a Finlandia solution. What does this EU think about this possibility? Yesterday, I asked the Ukrainian ambassador the same question. He said, "Oh, our people has to decide it. But if the Ukrainian people decide to stay with the West, I think the difficulties with Russia will grow. So what is the EU's position?"
I think a starting point would be that we hope that Russia today is not the Soviet Union of yesterday. I also would slightly disagree with your remark that there might have been some expectation that when the Soviet empire, so to say, started to collapse in Central and Eastern Europe before it affected the Soviet Union itself, there might have been expectation of a close relationship with what at the time in 1989 still was the Soviet Union. That is not my recollection. And this is not how I see the uprising peacefully, very fortunately, in Central and Eastern Europe. I think everybody who had been to Prague, Budapest, Warsaw, could not have the slightest doubt about the inclination of people there. And sort of what is now suggested basically is, well, because this was accepted, obviously, at the time by the Soviet Union for a number of countries in its immediate neighborhood in the Baltics, further away in Central Europe, does not apply to the Ukraine, which is not too far away geographically. So my question, to your suggestion would be, do we really think that this is a situation where we can say, well, Russia might have political interests in this area and therefore the aspiration of the Ukrainian people can be denied? Would that be something which would be compatible with our values? Would that be something which would be compatible with our self-respect? Would there be anybody in the world who would believe us anymore if we talk about democracy, human rights, and rule of law?
Thanks very much, Ambassador. Let's go to this gentleman here, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
My name is Miyoshi Yomiuri Shimbun, staff writer. The problem of Ukraine. Ukraine is one of the big exporter of arms, weapons to China. And will the EU do something to work on Ukraine to stop or to make the export less? Otherwise, the Japanese government would be hesitant to assist the Ukraine government, although the EU asked Japanese government to assist the Ukraine government. Thank you.
I'm aware of Japanese concerns, and I know that this is being discussed bilaterally. It has not entered into our discussion to this point, though.
Thank you. Gentleman over there. Q&A is now open to everyone, not just the working press. So if you have any questions, catch up.
I'm Takeshi Hara from this crowd. I understand the Republic of Korea has successfully concluded FTA with EU about 3 years ago. But when it comes to Japan, my country, why is it taking so much time to finalize FTA or EPA between our country and Europe, EU? Thank you. Are there any great commercially sticking points? Thank you.
I think one of the reasons why we were able to conclude negotiations with Korea in a relatively short time was that when we started, the Republic of Korea had already more or less completely negotiated an agreement with the United States, which was then put on hold in Congress. But this agreement reflected the very strong determination of the government of the Republic of Korea to liberalize its trade and to enter into ambitious trade agreements. But when you compare the situation to Japan, I think your question would be justified if we were still negotiating in 2017. I think it took about 3 years for the Republic of Korea and the European Union, and we started negotiating with Japan in April last year, so less than a year ago. I think, therefore, we have to put things a bit in perspective here.
Thank you. Nicholas?
That comment does, of course, sound rather extraordinary. My recollection is the weighted average of agricultural import tariffs for Korea is somewhere around 95%. Europe is sitting at just under 10, and Japan is just under, just over 11. So, I mean, certainly talks between Japan and Europe would be something of the sort of pot calling the kettle black. There does seem to be a vacuum here at the moment with, obviously, Obama can't get his FTA worked out with Japan because he can't persuade his own party. So I find it difficult to understand why it was so fast with Korea, and with the vacuum created by the death for the time being of TPP, why you can't get something arranged with Japan.
Well, I think it was Mark Twain who talked about premature announcements of death. Huh? I'm not sure that anybody on our side would be willing to say TPP is dead. But again, if you look at Korea, we did negotiate for quite a while, and it's not really. I mean, I can't recall any trade negotiation, certainly not one between major economic actors, and certainly not one with the ambition to be an all-encompassing agreement, which would have been negotiated in a year or even in a year and a half. That's just not how things work, which, as I said in the beginning, doesn't really mean that we want to drag this out or delay things, but you can achieve progress if you give up sort of the ambition to have a very deep and far-reaching agreement, but that has never really been our objective. We always said that we want to negotiate quickly, but we will not be able and willing to sacrifice content and quality over timing. It's very, very simple.
Time for one or two questions. Let me just, Siegfried, gentleman over there.
Anthony Millington, European Automobile Manufacturers Association. I would like to ask you a little bit more about the review that will be conducted at the end of 12 months in the negotiations. My understanding of the terms of the mandate is that the review that will be conducted by the Commission and reported to the Member States is not a general review of progress in the negotiations, but is much more narrowly focused. It is a review of the extent to which Japan, in the first year of the negotiations, has fulfilled the commitments that were given in the scoping exercise to begin the process of eliminating NTBs. So whether Japan has actually eliminated NTBs or not is not the issue. The issue is whether or not the commitments given in the scoping exercise have been fulfilled. And the mandate requires the Commission to assess whether Japan's fulfillment of those commitments is, quotes, fully satisfactory. And if the commitments and the implementation of those commitments is not fully satisfactory, then the Commission is obliged to draw the appropriate consequences and recommend to the Member States that the negotiations should be suspended. Now, I fully understand that there's another round of negotiations to go, and everything could happen between now and April. But you did say in your remarks, Ambassador, that already the picture was reasonably clear. And I wonder if you can perhaps give us an indication as to which sectors you would regard the fulfillment of the commitments that have been so far implemented is fully satisfactory, and whether there are some other sectors where the Commission still hopes for progress between now and the end of the 5th round of negotiations. Thank you.
Yes. I didn't say, I think, that the picture was reasonably clear or very clear on the review. And you're absolutely right. What the review is about is not about reviewing progress in overall negotiations. I think what we just feel is that obviously, if you look at specific commitments made in the scoping exercise or during the scoping exercise, especially if you look a bit the way they were phrased with different timelines and with a bit of a margin of interpretation, obviously the overall context cannot be completely left aside. And therefore, when we, I think, look at progress so far, we see, for instance, on a number of issues that we are making progress, from beef exports to food additives. I mentioned pharmaceuticals, medical equipment. I could go on to safety standards of cars. And when I say progress, I say progress. I'm not saying that fulfillment of all the obligations in the scoping report, as we interpret it, has already been achieved. And therefore, I think this is for the next round, and this is for the assessment of the Commission, and then ultimately for Member States to judge. And you will understand that it would be a bit premature to now go through all the different areas, because you are familiar with the language. You know at least a substantial part of it better by heart than I do. And you know exactly what in the end, the room for appreciation will be. I think we have a clear commitment from the Japanese side to live up to the commitments undertaken, and this will be on the table when we conduct the review.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. We are now 3 minutes and 40 seconds over our allotted time, and I know many of you will want to go home, and you've got busy days tomorrow. So, unfortunately, we would normally give the Ambassador a complimentary membership of the club, but he's already got a complimentary membership, having spoken recently. So we decided to give him a bottle of very fine champagne.
Oh, that's good.
And thank you very much for your speech.
Thank you very much. Thank you.